Mrs. Wilson was an old lady who had never had the experience of flying alone, which is why she was perplexed when she arrived at the airport unsure of where to go. When she got to the airport, the elderly lady took a glance around and decided to join a group of passengers rushing to board the plane. She thought that by following them she'd have her way through the airport measures. Even though the elderly lady thought she was dressed up for the journey, a lot of passengers mistook her for a beggar, and they weren't the only ones. The woman at the check-in counter was a little confused when she saw that the lady had actually purchased a business class ticket. As she was following people who were actually traveling to an opposite destination, Mrs. Wilson, on the other hand, nearly missed her flight. Thanks to the assistance of a helpful airport employee, the elderly woman was finally able to reach the departure zone where she was supposed to be. Mrs. Wilson was taken to the gate marked on her boarding pass with a condescending smirk. The airport worker suggested she stay there and wait so she wouldn't get lost at the airport again and miss her flight. As it was a foreign place to her, the old woman kept fiddling anxiously with her handbag waiting for the boarding. A young man who was also traveling in business class approached her and asked if it was her first time traveling. Taken by surprise, the old lady replied with a shaking voice that it was indeed the first time she ever got on a plane. She then confessed that she was a little stressed and concerned about the flight. As she finished her sentence, the boarding began and the flight attendant started directing passengers to the boarding bridge. When she got to the plane, Mrs. Wilson was taken to her seat by the flight attendant who took the old woman's boarding card. Unfortunately, the old lady's torments were just starting. It turned out that her seat was next to a rude man. He had a disgruntled expression on his face when he spotted Mrs. Wilson. The moment she sat down, he laid down his magazine and yelled at the attendant, "Isn't this business class? Why should I pay more only to be seated next to an elderly beggar?" The flight attendant was horrified by his words, but she tried to calm him down and ensure the old lady had a somewhat pleasant flight. She told him that Mrs. Wilson had paid for the same ticket he did, and she had as much right to be seated there as he did. The obnoxious man yelled again, refusing to move his magazine from Mrs. Wilson's seat. In the midst of all the drama, the young man with whom she spoke earlier intervened. Unlike most of the other passengers on board, he refused to put up with the man's horrible behavior and came to the defense of the elderly lady. He yelled from his seat, "For the love of God, Mrs. Wilson is much older than you, and you're acting like a true lowlife by keeping her standing while lounging in your seat." Mr. Thompson, the obnoxious man, seemed visibly ashamed and calmed down a little after the young man's remark. When Mrs. Wilson realized that she'd have become the scandal's perpetrator, she sighed sadly and told everyone that was just going to switch to economy class. As her eyes filled with tears, she got her handbag and headed in the direction of the economy class. Mr. Thompson decided to back down as he received withering glances from many passengers. He finally had the spirit to withdraw the magazine from Mrs. Wilson's seat and asked her, nicely, to take a seat. She had as much right to sit there as he did. The old lady sank down in her seat, unable to say anything. She was so exhausted from what she's been through that she didn't pay attention to her open handbag. An ancient photograph with curled edges fell down from it, and Mr. Thompson saw it when it dropped and picked it up. He recognized a young kid in it. When he gave it back to Mrs. Wilson, he asked her if the picture meant a lot to her. The old lady took the picture with care and smiled. She told him that it was actually a picture of her son, the one who's piloting the plane they're boarded on. When the business class passengers overheard her statement, they instantly sat down ready to hear the whole story. Dorothy Wilson was a simple woman who grew up in a poor family with 4 siblings. Her parents were humble villagers who had a small farm that kept them from going hungry. Since Dorothy was the oldest, she bore a portion of the responsibility in taking care of her family, especially that Peter, the youngest of the brothers, had a mental disability that necessitated extra care and attention. When World War II started, her father volunteered for the army and served in the Pacific Islands fighting the Japanese forces. Before he left, he gave her a golden heirloom that he acquired from his grandfather before. Unfortunately, tragedy would soon hit her house as her father lost his life in the battlefield. He was laid to rest in a coffin draped in the American flag. Dorothy grew older and it was time for her to have a family of her own. But since her mother refused to remarry after her father passed away, she was forced to stay with her mother and assist in the care of her mentally ill brother. Dorothy's other two siblings have moved to the city, leaving their brother and sister to chance, alone to face life's toughest challenges with no external support. Because of her family condition, Dorothy only met her real love when she was 28, after she had given up hope of ever getting married. Jack, her husband, was a very attractive and smart man. He was a shepherd and spent his days in the green fields with his sheep. Dorothy felt like she was in a real-life fantasy. Their love grew so quickly the pair decided to get married soon. But the Wilsons' jinx struck again and prevented the poor girl from celebrating her bliss. Peter, her mentally challenged brother, set their house on fire. Jack went in to try to save him, but they both perished in the flames. After losing their home, Dorothy and her mother were forced to live in an old shanty they acquired using the proceeds from the sale of Jack's sheep. A few weeks after that, Dorothy found out that she was expecting a child. At the time, her mother had already begun to show signs of dementia. Kate's state was so bad that she even tried assaulting her pregnant daughter with a knife on several occasions, blaming all of her problems on her daughter. Despite everything, Dorothy was able to have a healthy and stable pregnancy and gave birth to a lovely baby boy. Even though she was thrilled to hold her child in her arms, she was also terrified that her mother would inadvertently injure him. After she went back home with her newborn, she just lived in constant terror for the safety of her baby for 3 full years. After Kevin turned 3, she decided to put him in an orphanage as she was no longer able to ensure his safety. Dorothy believed that the boy would be better off in an orphanage than living with a grandmother who could hurt him at any time. Dorothy stayed with her mother for several years until the illness took her over. Shortly after her mother's passing, Dorothy returned to the orphanage with the hopes of returning home with her son. Sadly, she learned that Kevin had been adopted. She kept looking for her son for many years, but it was only recently that she was able to locate him. Dorothy was finally able to find her son thanks to a volunteer organization dedicated to finding missing relatives. Finding her son was the only reason she purchased a business class ticket to be closer to her son, who is currently flying the plane. Mrs. Wilson was finally able to see her son on her 87th birthday. She says that it is a happy coincidence and that she'll finally be able to die in peace. Mrs. Wilson's story left everyone in the business class in tears, and shortly after her heartfelt narrative, an announcement came over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking to you. Our flight is coming to an end, and I'd like to express my love for my mother, who's traveling with us today, and tell her that I've forgiven her a long time ago," the pilot said, to everyone's utmost surprise. Dorothy got more than what she bargained for, and she couldn't keep her tears from falling, hearing her son say that he loves her after years of trying to locate him. After the plane landed, Kevin came and looked for his long-gone mother. The two of them had a long and warm embrace, and Dorothy was finally able to hold her son with pride this time instead of fear.